My name is William Clark. I'm the director of the program in International and Comparative Studies. Welcome to our first lecture of our lecture series for the year. The lecture series features our fellows. PICS fellows have been contributing to the growth of our program and the growth of our curriculum throughout the college since the program's inception. And the PICS program, Fellows program, has made it possible for us to serve an ever-increasing demand amongst our undergraduate students for classes in the program in International and Comparative Studies. Today's speaker is Professor Andrew Kerner. Andrew Kerner holds a PhD 2009 from Emory University. More importantly, he's a native of Maplewood, New Jersey, which is a very important line on his vita as far as I'm concerned. Professor Kerner is a professor of political science. He's an assistant professor there and a faculty associate at the Center for Political Studies at the Institute for Social Research. Professor Kerner studies politics of corporate finance. He's particularly interested in and writes about foreign direct investment, corporate governance, and the role of pension funds and pension reform in political economy of stock market development. He's currently working on a book project, which forms the basis, I think, of today's talk, that explores the political implications of pension reform. He's the author of published papers in the British Journal of Political Science and the International Studies Quarterly on topics such as bilateral investment treaties and the international and domestic determinants of insider trader laws. He was the recipient of a grant from Ernst & Young of Poland, and where he conducted a project entitled The Political Economy of Investment Protection. Today's talk is entitled The Ownership Society, Political Implications of Pension Reform. I'd like to welcome my friend Andrew Kerner.
So, thank you all for coming. Everyone here. Thanks for coming. I really do want to particularly thank the International Institute and the wonderful PICS Fellowship that has allowed me to teach, of course, the politics of debt, but also allows me to give this talk, which is really fantastic. So thank you guys for coming. Thanks, Bill, and everyone else for making this happen. So as Bill mentioned, the title of today's talk that I'm going to give is The Ownership Society, Political Implications of Pension Reform. It's sort of a distillation of a book project of the same title. And before getting into any sort of particulars, I just want to define sort of the one central term in this talk, and that's the ownership society. So when I say the ownership society, what I mean is a society, I'll just read it, a society in which political behavior is influenced by larger, more widespread capital endowments than would exist in the absence of a public intervention, right? So it's sort of the political dynamics that exist after the government has come in, put in some sort of public policy that leads more people to own more stock, more people to own more bonds, and to more intimately tie their personal welfares to the movements of financial markets. The term ownership society, I think, was sort of popularized, if not invented, during George W. Bush's term as a way of sort of describing the anticipated political effects of his never enacted Social Security reform. And the idea behind the Social Security reform was that he was going to take the traditional Social Security model and move it modestly towards something that looked more like a national 401k. And the assumption at the time among commentariat and people within the government was that doing so was going to create an altered political environment. And that altered political environment was the ownership society, right? That people would come to own more stocks, people would come to own more bonds, their welfare was going to be more tied to the movements of financial markets. That was going to change their politics. And in particular, it was going to make them more conservative, more amenable to Republican policy initiatives and conservative ideas more generally. And this would redound nicely to the political prospects of the Republican Party and just sort of the ideological, their ideological prospects as well. The concept behind this is not, even if the term is somewhat novel to Bush, in that era, the concept has a much longer provenance, and it's sort of a knockoff of Thatcher's Enterprise Society from the early 80s, which is virtually the same thing, although they're focused more on the privatization of council housing, although also with a pension component. So that's what I mean by the ownership society. The ownership society is this altered political environment that comes from expanded ownership of financial assets. And the question that I'm going to be asking in this book and in this talk is this a figment of our imaginations? So does the ownership society actually exist? And so that is to say, are politics altered in any sort of discernible and consistent way by expanding financial ownership? And if it does exist, what does it look like? So how exactly are politics being altered by the expansion of financial asset ownership? And to do that, I'm going to be exploring the political implications of Latin American pension reform. What's interesting about Latin American pension reform, well, lots of things are interesting. What's particularly interesting in the context of this talk and in the introduction I just gave was that Latin American pension reform, beginning in Chile and then sort of spreading across the continent in the 1990s, was sort of the intellectual and policy blueprint for Bush's Social Security reform. The big difference being Latin American pension reform actually happened. Bush's Social Security program never happened. So we can actually go back and look at the Latin American data and try and get some sense about what actually happens when you engage in this sort of policies. The answer, to sort of jump ahead of myself a little bit, because it's not a mystery novel, the answer to my first question is yes, the ownership society does exist. There are consistent, discernible effects, changes in political behavior that result from the expansion of financial asset ownership as a consequence of pension reform, at least in the Latin American context. And the answer to the second question, if so, what does it look like, is that the primary vehicle through which the expansion of financial ownership changes political behavior is that it changes the way people make retrospective evaluations about macroeconomic performance. It changes the way they perceive the quality of the incumbent government, and it changes the way they perceive markets as sort of an organizing principle. And in each case, it creates a privileged position for financial returns and pension assets, and pension returns in this case. So people's perceptions of how the macroeconomy are going increasingly track with pension returns the more people are exposed to financial markets through their pensions. The capacity of incumbent governments to get reelected begins to track more with pension returns when pension reform has led to widespread financial ownership, and people's sort of ideological beliefs about whether or not the markets are an appropriate way to organize a political economy, those also start to track with pension returns. What's notable is what it doesn't do. It doesn't actually make people more conservative. And this is really the whole idea behind the Bush plan. What it does is it makes people's conservatism to some extent a function of pension returns. But where pension returns are low, it has the opposite effect. Even more so than that, it's even worse than it appears. If you were hoping that expanding financial ownership would lead to a more conservative population, because the effects on the low end of the return spectrum are much, much larger than the effects on the high end of the spectrum. And more often than not, the effects on the high end of the return spectrum don't even really exist. They're not discernible. So what happens, the nut of this, is that when you expand financial ownership, you're creating a vehicle for making people feel more negative about the macroeconomy when their pension returns are low, for making them not elect re-incumbents when financial returns are low, and for rebelling against the markets as an organizing principle when financial returns are low. And there's almost no evidence that there's a symmetric effect on the opposite end of the spectrum. No one seems to be celebrating high pension returns with more optimism about the economy, more support for the incumbent government, or more support for markets as an organizing principle. So not exactly, I don't think, what the ownership society sort of intellectual architects anticipated. Okay, so having sort of previewed where I'm going with this, the agenda for the rest of the talk is, first I want to talk through the intuition of the ownership society. So why is it exactly that expanding financial asset ownership across society might lead to some kind of consistent or discernible shift in politics, the relationship between citizens and their government. And in particular, I'm going to talk about two ways of conceiving about this effect. So one is sort of a prospective, ideologically based hypothesis about how the ownership society should exist, right? And in this sort of framework, the consequence of giving people financial assets is that it changes the way they think about how their future interests are going to be served by politics, and it often has an ideological component. So you get stocks, and you think, now that I'm a stockholder, I want a certain set of policies that in the future are going to, benefit me as a stockholder. An alternative, the one that I'm going to sort of suggest is more accurately characterizes the data, is what I'm going to call a retrospective ownership society, such that the effect of expanding financial ownership doesn't really have these sort of grand ideological implications. What it does is it changes the way people look to the recent past to sort of understand whether or not their interests are being served either by politics or by the macroeconomy more generally. Having gone through that, I'm then going to talk a little bit about pension reform and Latin American pension reform in particular. Then I'm going to briefly go through some of the data that I'm using to test my hypotheses and some of the results, some of the consistent results that come out, and then I'll conclude with some final thoughts. Okay, so the intuition behind the ownership society, I think, is pretty simple. You can thank Ken Coleman for the complete absence of Greek symbols on the next few slides. I don't think I need them. But the idea behind the ownership society is that you can imagine a world, and I don't think you have to imagine too hard, where different people have different endowments of financial capital. Some people have 401ks, some don't. Some people have a bunch of stocks and bonds, some don't. And the more capital any given person owns, the more their income is going to depend on the returns to that capital, right? If you don't own any stocks, you don't own any bonds, then your income, and all your income is a function of your wages, sort of what you're getting from your own labor, then the movements of financial markets don't really have much bearing directly on your welfare. The more stocks and bonds you own, the more the movements of those financial markets are impacting your wealth and your income. Okay. A sort of corollary to this is we can think about the returns to financial capital and the returns to financial capital as being something that's largely informed, not exclusively, but largely informed by public policies, right? There are certain public policies that do or are believed to increase the returns to financial capital. And so the more financial capital you own, and the more the returns to financial capital are impacting your own welfare, the more likely you are going to be to support a set of policies and politicians that support those policies that hold the promise of increasing financial returns, and the less likely you are to support policies and politicians that will not increase the returns to financial capital. And so there we get this split between sort of the political orientations of people who own capital and the political orientations of people who don't own capital. And then the sort of final rub to this is that governments know this, right? Governments know that people who own capital are different than people who don't own capital. And many governments may, for ideological or practical reasons, prefer to operate in an environment where the average citizen prefers policies and politicians that will support financial returns rather than labor returns. And so if government does prefer to operate in that environment, they can do something about it. They can enact all manner of public policies to increase the extent to which the median voter, or society in general, owns financial assets. And they can do that through tax policy, through regulatory policy, to incentivize people to own financial assets. They can do that through various privatization schemes, by voucher privatizations and otherwise sort of distributing privatized firms broadly throughout society. And importantly, they can do that through pension reform. And I'll talk about, and pension reform I think is probably the most dramatic way in which a single public policy can reorient the extent to which a society's welfare is pegged to financial markets. Okay, so that's kind of the intuition behind the ownership society, why we should expect changes in the distribution of capital to imply changes in political behavior. That notion, the sort of core notions here, that capital and labor are different, that the owners of capital have political priorities that differ from the owners of labor, is really there's really nothing novel about it. It's one of the core sort of insights of the political economy literature. Going back as far as political economy literature goes back, any good Marxist can tell you that capital and labor are different, and that those differences have some pretty profound implications for their policy preferences and for the politics that they prefer. There is, and that intuition sort of runs through all manner of sort of contemporary work in political economy. There's a sort of not exactly emerging, but relatively recent literature suggesting that differences between the policy preferences of capital and labor sort of form the foundation for democratic development. And then, alternative literature suggests that differences between capital and labor have implications for monetary policy preferences, for trade preferences, really just about anything. There's two literatures in particular that sort of inform, that are in some ways just perfectly representative of this, but also that are particularly informative of my own views on this. One of this is the corporate governance policy literature. And what's interesting about the corporate governance policy literature, or what's interesting about corporate governance policy in this respect, is that you've got a lot of policies that sort of juxtapose the interests of capital and labor pretty starkly. So there are some corporate governance policies that really favor shareholders, other corporate governance policies that tend to favor labor. And the literature that sort of seeks to explain when we see certain corporate governance policy outcomes tends to hold the belief, and it's supported by a lot of empirical work, that societies where the median voter is more likely to be a shareholder, those societies are more likely to be societies where we see corporate governance policies that favor shareholder interests. Conversely, societies where the median voter is not a shareholder, where the median voter is labor, we tend to see corporate governance policies that do the opposite. And there's sort of a similar parallel literature in the sort of economic voting literature, and in particular, it's called the patrimonial voting literature. But the core insight of this literature is that people who own shares, people who own financial assets of all kinds, really, tend to be more conservative, tend to support conservative politicians and conservative policies. And sort of to the extent that this is part of the zeitgeist in the academic literature, it's reflected, I think, in the sort of political zeitgeist in popular culture. So this is from an article written by Grover Norquist in 2004, which is really at the height of Bush's sort of frenzy around Bush's proposed Social Security reform. And he writes, "Every American who owns his own mutual fund is decreasingly susceptible to the siren calls of class warfare. According to Scott Rasmussen, if you own $5,000 in stock, you are 18% less likely to be a Democrat, more likely to be a Republican. 4 more years of more and bigger individual retirement accounts means 4 more years of Republicans and fewer Democrats." So he turned out not to be right. I mean, the Democratic Party turned out not to be toast. But nonetheless, one of the things that sort of links Norquist's view of the ownership society with the academic view of the ownership society is that it's all very perspective looking, right? And it's all very ideological, right? What happens when you give someone capital is that you're changing their beliefs about what policies will best serve them in the future, right? And that's really sort of the core assumption here. That might be true. I don't think it's true, but maybe it is true. But in any event, let me just suggest an alternative view, which is not so much that the core political implication of expanding financial asset ownership is changing people's ideology, but it's changing the way they experience the economy, it's changing the way they experience politics, and it's changing their sort of retrospective beliefs about what is serving their best interests and what is not. And to that end, we can think about sort of retrospective politics, right? Before we sort of get into the implications for pension reform and for the ownership society more generally, there's a few kind of stylized intuitions that come out of the political science literature that are relevant here. So one is that we know, just as a stylized fact, that voters tend to reward good recent macroeconomic outcomes, and they tend to punish bad recent macroeconomic outcomes. Right? Anyone who's even a casual observer of American politics, I think this will ring true with. Certainly in the last presidential election, we all had to hang on the new unemployment numbers and the new GDP numbers, and the conventional wisdom was that this was going to have really, really significant implications for whether or not Obama was going to get reelected. If you're not familiar with the academic literature on the topic, you can just trust me on this, that the same sort of dynamics happen to different degrees and to varying extents, but they happen all over the world. So just in general, voters tend to reward good times. They tend to punish bad times, and there's a tendency to look backwards in whether or not, in how they're making those assessments. Another sort of intuition that's important here is that different people define good differently in this context, right? And again, sort of casual observation about the American political economy, say since Reagan, so since like 1980, this should ring true with a lot of people. If you aren't familiar with the academic literature, certainly the period since 1980 has been very, very good for certain sets of people and perhaps less good for other sets of people. And we might anticipate that the better the economy is for you or people like you, the more positive you're going to feel about macroeconomic performance. The worse it's been for you, the more negative you're going to feel about macroeconomic performance. So your evaluations of what's happened in the recent past may vary from individual to individual. And one dimension on which that variation may manifest itself is whether or not you own financial assets, right? If you don't own any financial assets, then your perception of how the macroeconomy is going is probably going to be relatively unaffected by how financial markets are performing, because they're not really affecting your income. You're probably aware of it. It's probably affecting your sort of stylized knowledge of the economy on the margins, but it's not really affecting your pocketbook. The more financial assets you own, the more salient financial market performance becomes to your sort of retrospective assessment of how the macroeconomy is behaving. And then a final sort of stylized sort of intuition that's going to be really important for me is that past market performance can shape popular opinions about the trade-off between market and state provision of social welfare, right? So when markets are performing, there's historical precedent for when markets perform really poorly that sours people on the market provision of social welfare in a way that doesn't happen when markets are performing particularly well. There's a piece by Parodi and Schweinbacher who sort of make this case, and there's a few affiliated pieces as well, but the intuition behind these cases that these are historical cases based primarily on Europe, and the idea is that at the sort of turn of the 20th century, we had in Europe a pretty robust system of market-based social welfare provision in the insurance industry and the pension industry, so on and so forth. And then what you had in the interwar periods and the post-war periods is in some countries, hyperinflationary decimation of those markets and sort of the sort of associated wiping out of financial wealth of good chunks of the middle class in those countries. And in countries where you had this hyperinflation, what you saw, among other things, was a citizenry that sort of turned against the idea of market-based welfare provision as a general principle. And the country sort of went forward with more state-based provision of social welfare and state-based provision of pensions and insurance and social insurance. And we saw that to a much lesser degree in countries that didn't experience those hyperinflationary episodes. So between all three of these, right, these are all sort of intuitions about how previous economic performance might shape contemporary politics, right? People vote based on recent macroeconomic performance. How they're perceiving recent macroeconomic performance is going to be shaped in part by their financial endowments and just their sort of broader perception about the proper role of state and market, particularly in the provision of social insurance, is going to be, at least on the margin, shaped by recent market performance. So all those intuitions can travel pretty well into hypotheses about what we should expect from the ownership society and what we should expect when we see an expansion of financial assets. And these are all sort of hypotheses that assume a retrospective viewpoints. This is how do people sort of retrospectively behave differently. One way they might retrospectively behave differently, or behave differently with respect to retrospective assessments of the economy, is that the more you increase financial ownership, the more the median voter comes to own financial assets, the more their opinions about how the macroeconomy is doing is going to be a function of financial returns. So in the case of pension reform, be a function of pension returns. And we should expect an environment with high financial ownership and high returns to those financial assets, that people are going to have more positive assessments of the macroeconomy. In a context where we have high financial ownership and low returns on those financial assets, we might expect the opposite, that people are actually going to have more negative assessments of the economy. On a very similar sort of vein, we should expect similar dynamics with respect to incumbent re-election, right? If incumbent re-election depends on recent macroeconomic performance, then in societies where there's been a lot of where the median voter is a financial asset holder, where there's been broad distribution of financial assets, the incumbent's ability to get re-elected is going to be more of a function of the returns on those financial assets. Where we have broad distribution of financial assets and high returns, we should expect more votes for the incumbent. Where we have broad distribution of financial assets and low returns, we should expect fewer incumbents. And then a final hypothesis that I'm going to test with respect to Latin America is that the effect of increased financial ownership on citizens' opinions about the proper role of state and market is also going to depend on financial returns, right? So when you turn people into financial asset holders, the better those returns are doing, the more jazzed they're going to be about the market as an organizing principle and the market as a provider of social insurance and social welfare. The worse those returns are doing, the more negative they're going to feel about these things. And there's something I want to point out. There's two things that I want to point out. So the first thing, the importance of hypothesis 3 here, is that this is really of these three, this is the one hypothesis that really does make sufficiently distinct predictions than an ideological-based version of the ownership society, right? So if the principal consequence of expanding financial asset ownership was that it makes people more conservative, we should expect to see expanded financial asset ownership on its own to be sufficient to make people, like the market, identify as more conservative, so on and so forth. If it's really just changing the way they're perceiving recent economic performance, then we would expect much more of a conditional relationship. And the other thing to point out is that all three of these hypotheses presume that the effect of financial ownership is going to be conditional on returns, and there's no reason to expect that those relationships are going to be symmetric with respect to returns. In fact, we know from literature by Kahneman and Tversky and other sort of related literatures that people tend to be loss averse, and losses tend to make a more profound, sort of indelible impression on people's psychology than gains. So we might expect, there's a good theoretical basis to expect that in all three of these, losses are going to be more politically salient than gains. Okay. So with that, that's sort of the ownership society. Those are the three hypotheses that I'm going to be testing. And I'll be testing these in the context of pension reform, and in particular Latin American pension reform. And when I say pension reform, I'm referring to a very specific form of pension reform, and that's the transition of pay-as-you-go defined benefit pension systems, pay-as-you-go defined benefit systems towards funded defined contribution systems. So a pay-as-you-go defined benefit system, the defined benefit indicates, that just means that the benefit that people receive in their retirement is sort of defined in law as sort of a formulaic expression of how much they've paid into the system. And the pay-as-you-go part of that means that current retirees' benefits are being financed by current workers' tax contributions. So it's really more of a transfer system. The US Social Security system is a pretty good example of a pay-as-you-go defined benefit system. Those pay-as-you-go defined benefit systems have come under a lot of stress, and there's been a lot of reform, a lot of calls for reform of them. One of the principal reasons for this, among many, is demographic shifts. As society ages, you end up with more people collecting benefits and fewer people financing those benefits, and the only way to make that equation work is to tax more and potentially tax to the point where it's economically detrimental. And so for that and a variety of other reasons, there's been a movement away from pay-as-you-go defined benefit systems towards funded defined contribution systems. And funded defined contribution systems is more like a 401k system. So the defined contribution, well, the funded part simply means that instead of acting as a series of transfer payments, when the taxpayer pays into their own pension system, pays into their own pension, it's actually going into an account in their name and it's being invested in a financial asset. So it's sort of funding their own retirement rather than someone else's retirement. The defined contribution means that while their contributions into this pension system are sort of defined, at least vaguely in law, the benefits that they get out of it are not. The benefits are going to be at least partially a function of the performance of the financial assets that they've invested in. So the funded defined contribution, the movement towards funded defined contribution brings people's welfare closer to the ups and downs of financial markets. And as it's sort of relevant for me, it creates in societies, in countries that have transitioned from a pay-as-you-go defined benefit to a funded defined contribution, it creates a rather large class of newly minted financial asset owners. And it's their behavior that I'm particularly interested in. That's one reason to sort of be thinking about pension funds in this way, because it's sort of this very efficient and very common vehicle for turning people into shareholders and turning people into bondholders. Another reason to sort of think about the political consequences of pension reform is that pension reform has really always been a pretty profound tool of social engineering, right? Lots of the sort of big thinkers in pension policy have used it for precisely these ends. I mean, certainly the Bush ownership society rhetoric had a social engineering component to it. The Thatcher enterprise society had a social engineering component. But the first, so I'm doing okay on time, the very first sort of recognizable pension system was actually put in by Caesar Augustus. And this was purely a social engineering. So Caesar Augustus had this problem of returning legionnaires that didn't really have any interest in the maintenance of the Roman Empire. And so they had this pesky habit of starting and participating in wars on the empire's periphery. And this was pretty detrimental. And so one of the things that Caesar Augustus did to try and get them to behave themselves was give them a pension. And if they had a pension, then they'd have more of an interest in maintaining the political status quo, which was to Caesar Augustus's liking. The sort of most famous sort of modern innovation in pensions was Bismarck's pensions in Prussia. And this, too, was very much an exercise in social engineering. So for Bismarck, his problem wasn't returning legionnaires, but it was an increasingly restive class of industrial workers. And just like Caesar Augustus, he wanted to give them a pension, wanted to give them more of a stake in the maintenance of the political status quo to try and decrease the political sort of appeal of socialism. And so he gave them a pension. He was quite forward about this. So this is Bismarck speaking to the Reichstag. I will consider it a great advantage when we have 700,000 small pensioners drawing their annuities from the state, especially if they belong to those classes who otherwise do not have much to lose by an upheaval and erroneously believe that they can actually gain for it. So the pensions are really meant as an exercise in social engineering. And Jose Piñera, who played a large role in crafting the original Latin American pension reform in Chile, which then served as the basis for the rest of Latin America, and then in the sort of aborted attempt in the U.S., he too was very much sort of thinking about pension reform as an exercise in social engineering. So Piñera was coming out of environment. He was very much an anti-Allende sort of activist, was coming out of an environment where he wanted to do everything in his power to undercut the appeal of socialism in Chile, and pension reform was part of that, right? He was going to stick people with a lot of stocks and a lot of financial assets and make them a little bit more beholden to the market and a little bit more friendly towards market-friendly policies. And he notes that his reform not only resolves looming fiscal and social crises, but it creates a world far different than the one Bismarck engendered. It creates a world of worker capitalists. So again, the sort of notion that pension policies can be a sort of efficient tool of social engineering is not some weird thing that I've invented for the purposes of this talk. It actually is a pretty foundational part of pension policy more generally. Okay, so with that aside, pension reform in Latin America, 'cause that's really the laboratory that we're going to be exploring to understand what pension reform's effects are. The original pension reform was in Chile. This is the one that Jose Piñera largely, although not exclusively, designed. That was put into place under Pinochet in 1981. For obvious political reasons, there was not a whole lot of movement in Latin America to copy Pinochet, so it sort of remained dormant for a while. But then in the 1990s, as Chile democratized and doing what Pinochet did was sort of somewhat less of a dirty word, lots of Latin American countries followed suit with pension reforms that differed in sometimes meaningful ways, but largely followed some degree of the Chilean model. So Peru in 93, Argentina in 1994, Colombia in 93, Uruguay, Panama, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Mexico. All these countries in those years have gone some way, not as far as Chile necessarily, but some way towards replacing or complementing their sort of legacy defined benefit, pay-as-you-go social security system with a funded defined contribution alternative that looks a little bit more like a national 401k system. But there's extraordinary variation. Oh, I should say before we talk about variation, the systems themselves are huge, right? So in 2008, Argentina backtracked on its system, which is why the sort of peak enrollment is 2007. But at its peak, there were 76 million workers enrolled in a funded defined contribution pension system in Latin America through one of these national reform systems. And that 76 million is a large number in and of itself, but it sort of almost certainly understates considerably the actual sort of footprint of these systems, because those 76 million workers have dependents, and those 76 million workers have, neighbors and such. And so the welfare of these countries are really, to a very significant degree, aligning themselves with the market. What's nice about the Latin American pension system is a laboratory for understanding how redistributions of financial assets affect political behavior is that you've got, across a whole bunch of different countries, reforms in different years that have different coverage rates. So sometimes these reforms are covering virtually all formal sector workers. Sometimes these reforms are covering a relatively small portion of these workers. And so we get variation on how deep these reforms go. And we also get variation in the returns. So in any given year, in some countries, returns are up, and in every given year, in other countries, the returns are down. So it's just a nice universe of variation to try and draw out some of the statistical relationships that can inform whether or not these hypotheses have much to them. So just some descriptive statistics here to get a sense of the scale of Latin American pensions. So this is from IOS, which is sort of an aggregator of financial data. I'm going to use this data in a moment. It's an aggregator of financial data from Latin American pension systems. And this is just a measure of affiliates to economically active population. And I've chosen 2004 to 2009, just so we can see as much of Argentina as possible before it drops off the face of the earth. And one thing we can see is that participation is pretty high. So an affiliate is someone who at some point in their life has contributed to a funded defined contribution pension system. So in Chile, basically everyone is doing it. And in fact, the reason it's over 100% is that there are people who at some point have contributed but then fall out of the economically active population. So there are actually more affiliates than there are at any given point economically active people. But we see these percentages quite high across the board, but still with some variation. Bolivia is relatively low, Chile is relatively high, Costa Rica is relatively high, Mexico is relatively high. This is affiliates. The sort of same patterns exist if you look at active contributors, although the numbers are somewhat lower. If you look at the proportion of the economically active population that's an active contributor, so contributing to their pension every month, that tops out at more like 40% in Chile, right? And so the discrepancy between those numbers is largely a function of people who leave the formal sector workforce or become unemployed. Okay, this is just a sense of how big these pension funds are in financial terms relative to the economy. You can sort of excuse the Spanish. This is pension funds in relation to GDP. And so this is just the total pool of financial assets that are being invested on behalf of workers. And we see in Chile, which is really the largest, typically between the mid-60s, between 50s and 60%. So these are pension funds that are equal to about 60% of GDP on average, which is quite something. And there's a lot of variation there. So in the Dominican Republic, it's tiny, right? Even though a lot of people are participating, the assets themselves are extremely small. There's a lot of variation there as well. Okay, so in that pool of variation, I want to draw out how variation across these countries in terms of how many people are participating and what the returns to those pensions are affecting political behavior. And I'm going to take sort of three cuts at this. The first cut I'm going to take is using this Latino barometer data, and these are annual surveys of Latin America, annual public opinion surveys of Latin America. All across Latin America, they ask a lot of politically relevant questions. The problem with the good part about the Latino barometer data is that you've got consistent questions over a relatively long period of time. The bad part about the Latino barometer data is they never bother to ask anyone if they actually participate in a pension. So everything I'm going to extract from Latino barometer data, the question is, are countries with a larger percentage of people contributing to a funded defined contribution system, are those countries sort of systematically different under different return levels from countries that aren't? And in particular, I'm going to ask, we'll start with this question, right? So this first question was, how are people viewing the macroeconomy? So do citizens in country years with a greater percentage of pension contributors make different assessments of recent macroeconomic performance? And I'm going to use two questions that sort of get at this. One is they ask people, how has your personal economy, how's your household economy been doing over the last year? And how's the national economy been doing over the last year? And you can just, I'm not going to slog through the regression tables. I have a lot of controls and fixed effects and all that good stuff. But these are sort of the results. And what we see here is a series of conditional coefficients. So what this black line, this solid line is the effect of differences in the percent of people. So what's the marginal effect of increasing the percentage of people who are an active contributor to their pension return? And these dotted lines are sort of confidence interval. And so when all three lines are above 0, we can say that it's a statistically significant effect. And I'm interested in this effect as real pension returns vary, right? And so when you ask people, is your personal economy improving? At low pension returns, the more people that are actually participating in a financial defined contribution pension system, this is coded in such a way so that high scores mean it's not improving. People are getting angry. People really do not think that their personal economy is doing well when returns are low. So the more people are participating in one of these systems, the more that these negative returns are stimulating some sort of angry response What's not happening is at the other end of the spectrum, right? When returns are high, there's really no difference between countries where a lot of people enrolled in one of these systems and countries where very few people are enrolled in these systems. And we see the exact same effect when we're asking about national economic performance as opposed to household economic performance. So all this is to say that in terms of retrospective, sort of how people view the macroeconomy, the effect of increasing the amount of people who are participating in a financial defined contribution pension seems to be highly dependent on returns. And low returns seem to make people angry and pessimistic. High returns don't really seem to have much of an effect on people whatsoever. Another question we can ask: do citizens in country years with a greater percentage of pension contributors have different political views? Right? Are there sort of ideological, are their ideological views different, and are these differences in ideological views also a function of returns? I use two questions here. One is people had to self-declare where they were on a left-right continuum, with lower scores meaning more left. And also they were asked, is the market economy best for society? Which is sort of another way of getting at sort of a general orientation towards the market, where higher means no, the market economy is not best for society. And here we see the same with I'll start with this one. So this is the people being asked, is the market economy good for society? And what we see is that when returns are low, the more people are contributing to pensions, the more negative they feel about the market economy as being something that's good for society. On the very high end of the return spectrum, there's just the sort of slightest shred of evidence that perhaps more participation in a market-based pension system is making people more excited about the market as an organizing principle of society. But it's really dwarfed, and it's far less robust across multiple specifications than what we're seeing at low returns. And we're sort of seeing something vaguely similar with respect to left-right orientation, although the effect is much more muted. But nonetheless, remember that low scores here mean more leftist in your orientation. You can see the effect of increasing the amount of people that are contributing to a financial defined contribution system. When returns are low, for a good chunk of this distribution, people are actually more leftist as opposed to being more rightist. There's absolutely no indication that when returns are really high, people are becoming more right-oriented. So all of that is looking at this aggregate data, asking whether country years with high participation are different than country years with low participation. There's also some individual level survey data that we can use to get at this question. It's coming from a LAPOP survey. The upside of the LAPOP survey is that they actually did ask people whether or not they're contributing to a financially defined contribution pension system and how often they contribute. The downside is that it's just a single cross-section of data in 2010. So whereas previous tests were leveraging about a decade's worth of data, this is leveraging just a single year, and it's a very weird year right in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Nonetheless, we can ask whether or not within any given country, do people who are participating in one of these systems, do they have different political views than non-participants? And again, sort of looking at people's self-identification on a left-right continuum, as well as answers to these questions. And the question is, should the country or government, instead of the private sector, own the most important enterprises and industries of the country, be primarily responsible for creating jobs, implement strong policies to reduce inequality, be primarily responsible for providing retirement systems, primarily responsible for providing health services, be the most responsible for ensuring the well-being of the people. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to show you those individually. They all basically look the same. And so what I've done is sort of made an index out of them, sort of taking the average across them. And that sort of average, I think, speaks to a sort of broad market versus state preference in the provision of social welfare. And what we see is really the exact same thing that we saw in every other piece of data that I've shown you thus far. When we look at this state market index, higher scores mean more statist. And at low returns, in 2010, we're talking about, this is right in the aftermath of the financial crisis, so even the low returns were relatively high. But still, at the relatively low returns, people do not like the market as a means of sort of organizing social welfare. At high return, or actually, better way of saying that, at low returns, there is a significant difference between countries that have a lot of participation in the funded defined contribution pension system countries, individuals that are contributing to, I'm gonna start this over. At low returns, people who have funded defined contribution pension don't like the market as much as people who are not participating in those systems. So participation in this pension system is actually correlated with disliking the market. At high returns, there's no difference between the two. Right? So the low returns seem to be the politically salient aspect here. And if you look at people's left-right self-identification, nothing statistically significant. So the sort of broad brush answer here is that it has no effect on left-right orientation. But the coefficient estimates, which are sort of captured in this solid line, suggest that at relatively low returns, people are more leftist. At relatively high returns, there may be slightly more rightist, but to a much lower degree. And then the final evidence, you can guess what the next graph, they're all going to look the same. The final piece of evidence, do citizens in country years with greater percentage of pension contributors vote differently? And so this isn't survey data, but with a graduate assistant, we coded all presidential and legislative elections from 1980 to present in Latin America. And I'm showing you the presidential election returns, and it looks basically the same for legislative elections, but it seemed more kosher just to stick with presidential elections. And the dependent variable in this, I should say, is a percentage of vote accruing to the incumbent government. So how much of the vote is the incumbent government getting in a presidential election? And again, with a lot of controls. And what we're finding is that countries that have, when returns are low, in this sample, in election years, the lowest return was -6. But when returns are low, countries that have greater participation in a financially defined contribution system, they vote against the incumbent to a greater degree than countries that don't have that participation. When returns are high, nothing's happening. The effect is basically zero. When returns are high, no one's saying, wow, we really love the incumbent government. But when returns are low, they're saying, wow, now that we have all these defined contribution pension systems, we really can't stand the incumbent government. So summarizing all this, and I realize this was a lot of data, it's a very, very consistent effect that I'm finding, which makes me sort of reasonably secure in saying that this is actually an accurate representation of the political implications of funded defined contribution pension systems and the expansion of financial asset ownership more generally. And the sort of takeaway implications here is that the ownership society is real. There really are discernible, consistent, noticeable political implications of expanding financial asset ownership through pensions, but it's not really what it's not really what the sort of political zeitgeist would suspect it would be, right? It's not making people more conservative. What it's doing is aligning a lot of people's political views and behaviors across a real wide variety of different views and behaviors. It's aligning those actions and beliefs with the returns of their pension system. And more to the point, it's aligning those behaviors and beliefs with the low returns that they're experiencing to those pension systems. To the extent that pension reform was ever supposed to be a way of making people more conservative and more market acceptant and more market enthusiastic, at least in the Latin American context, there's really no evidence to suggest that it has or that it should if applied elsewhere. So with that, I've already taken up more time than I anticipated. So again, thank you very much. I would love to hear your questions.